Hello and welcome to Culture and Diversity for the Medical Sciences. Today we're going to be talking about diversity. Okay, so again, the book focuses on the heritage chain, and that's again this cultural link, the reproduction of culture from generation to generation. And so within the cultural reproduction of culture, you have a lot of diverse cultures across the planet. Okay. And so we're going to be focusing mostly on the United States. But again, the idea is depending on the country of origin you live in, the ethnic group you identify with, your religion, your common way of life, the people that you're exposed to determines your culture and the dominant culture that you identify with. Okay. So here in the United States, America is demographically diverse. And you can look at demographics when it comes to sex, race, sexual orientation, religion, etc. There are an incredible amount of cultures in the United States for various reasons, but mostly because it's a new country and people have come to the United States from all across the planet. So again, you have to ask the question though, is America a melting pot or is America a little bit more like oil and water? Do people in America completely mix? Do all the cultures mix in America or is there a lot of segregation? And so I think the answer to that question is a little bit mixed, okay? Because yeah, we've all adopted Italian food and Mexican food, but still there were legal segregation laws in place to make sure that white people and black people didn't live in the same neighborhoods in the 1950s. So, yes, you have a lot of diversity in America, but you also have an incredible amount of prejudice and discrimination against things that divert from the social norms, the culture of the dominant group in power, for example. Okay? So, race versus pan-ethnicity. So, again, where does race come from? What is the origin of race? So again, race comes from the need for Europeans to divide society into the upper class and the lower classes or the working classes. So there's no such thing as white or black or Hispanic 300 years ago. These are brand new social constructs, okay? The idea that race is founded in biology is completely inaccurate. Okay, our races that we use today, which we only have 5 recognizable races in the United States, do not accurately group people according to biological differences. A person who's white in the United States has more in common with anybody in Africa than they do their white next door neighbor. And again, this is because you need more genetic diversity within groups than you do between groups. So race is just one way that we divide into groups, okay? The idea of social stratification. We divide based upon race and sex and sexual orientation and country and social class. But race is just one way that we divide into groups, one way that there's diversity in the United States, okay? But again, racial categories do not accurately reflect biological differences between groups. The purpose of races being created in the first place by people was for economics, was for power, so that Europeans could dominate the elite social roles and then subjugate everybody else in the lower classes. Okay? So the US recognizes 5 races: white, black, American Indian, Asian, Pacific Islander. Everything else that any other possible is considered other. Okay? So that's the racial diversity of America. However, again, you need to be asking questions like, do you actually have a race? Is white actually a race? Is black actually a race? The people that identify as black actually have genetics in common. And this is where you need to start challenging your way of thinking a little bit. And I know that's a lot, it's hard to take in. But, the more I read books, the more I found out I was not white. Okay, again, I am blended. I am American. I am completely blended, just like everybody else in America. Okay, so one way America became diverse again is through immigration, because previously you had native people living in here, but then you had people coming over from Europe and Asia and Africa and Latin America. So you've had this incredible influx of diverse cultures, people that identify as different races, people that identify as different religions, different ways of life, for example. So, but a lot of that diversity comes through immigration. However, when you look at immigration and you look at the treatment of immigrants in the United States, again, it's not always pretty. There's so much prejudice and discrimination involved. Were we prejudiced and discriminatory toward Asians? Well, absolutely. Asian people are the only people that, even if they were American citizens, we just took their citizenship away with the Chinese Exclusion Act and then denied them access until the late 1930s when we finally got rid of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Was Americans historically prejudicial and discriminatory toward Africans? I mean, they were brought over as slaves. Then they were subjugated into the lower classes, and they were not given access to education and to jobs. What about women? Same thing. Women have been denied access longer than any other group. Women are the most oppressed of all people on the planet. No group is more oppressed than women. Not African Americans, not Jewish people, not Muslims. Women are the most oppressed. They experience the most prejudice and discrimination. So, again, these cultural differences, depending on your stance, an ethnocentric stance versus a cultural relativistic stance. What kind of a stance do you take toward these cultural differences? Okay, and that's a really big question, because anything that differs from the social norms tends to receive stigmatization and prejudice and discrimination. Okay, and in the naturalization process, the book talks about as one way that people come over as immigrants. Poverty is one of the biggest aspects of social stratification. Okay. Again, poverty influences the lower classes. Okay. People that are in poverty have less access to education, less access to jobs, less access to healthcare, less access to rising up the social class ladder. Poverty is associated with higher rates of drug use, higher rates of abuse and violence. Okay. So, poverty is a major factor in society. Okay. So, poverty is higher for minorities and children. And again, it influences our access, our ability to rise up the social class ladder. Where your parents are located, for example, the neighborhood you grow up in, is associated with more than just access, though. It's associated with psychological factors such as intelligence. And this is where things get really dark and depressing, because people that grow up in poverty tend to score lower on intelligence quotient tests. And yeah, what are the tests measuring? And do they really accurately measure IQ? But again, IQ scores are associated with being able to rise up the social class ladder. So does it matter what kind of education a child gets? Yes. Does it matter what kind of neighborhood a child grows up in? Yes. Okay, the culture of poverty, the cycle of poverty, this reproduction of social classes from generation to generation affects, lots of people. Okay, so again, if you look at America and you look at capitalism, and what's the goal of capitalism? To consolidate wealth into the hands of the few. So those that have upper class elite positions, which historically were white males who had the privileged position, and all non-white males tended to get subjugated into the lower classes, so they were then exposed to higher rates of poverty. So are that are non-white exposed to higher rates of poverty? Absolutely. People that are non-white tend to be twice as likely to be in poverty as somebody that is white. Not that somebody who's non-white isn't just as capable of anybody else genetically. However, they're not given access, and they're not developed as much because they don't have as many good chances to go to as good of schools and things like that. And again, America is not fair. It's not equitable. Okay, there's a reason that white privilege is a thing. Okay, and it's not like some, like made up thing. Like, white privilege is very real, and you can see that when it comes to interviewing and hiring rates and promotion rates and how many CEOs are black versus white. Okay, so again, people that are born in poverty, getting out of the social class you're born into is not as common. And you would like to say it's because of psychological factors, like, well, they could all just go get two jobs, etc., and get themselves out of poverty. But that's not the way it works, because what if they've never been trained? What if they don't have the education? What if they've never been taught how to really fill out an application? If I go to an interview, I know the words to get the job. You talk about labor, you talk about cost, you talk about EBITDA, EBITDA, the bottom line overall profit on the bottom. If you walk in talking about costs and labor and and EBITDA, like, you're automatically going to get that job. But to people that are poor, are they even socialized into the way of life? Okay, do they have access to pay for college? Do they have access to an education that prepares them for that interview? Okay, does growing up in a good school system in a nice neighborhood, are you socialized to take the lead positions more than people that live in poverty? Is there an association with that? So, albeit America is very diverse, not all diverse populations have the same access because of the isms: racism, sexism, okay, heterosexism. So people that don't identify as straight, people that don't identify as white, people that don't identify as male experience higher rates of prejudice and discrimination, experience higher rates of not getting access, or not higher rates, but they don't have as much access for rising up the social class ladder. Okay. So, and this is all based upon institutionalized ideology that is culturally constructed and reproduced from generation to generation. Okay. So again, where you grow up matters. The culture that you identify with matters. Okay? Thank you so much for listening. Please email me with any questions.